Hi, my name is Grace, and this is my Week 7 case brief. So the case that I'll be briefing today is the District of Columbia v. Heller, which was decided by the U.S. Supreme Court in 2008. So the overall background of the case was that in 1975, the Firearms Control Regulation Act was passed in the District of Columbia, which banned and outlawed any private possession and ownership of handguns in the district. And at the time, this legislation was very highly contested because it was the most strict gun regulation at the time, and it also just a lot of people didn't agree with it. And although the law itself outlawed the ownership of any sort of handgun, it did allow for the ownership of shotguns and rifles and other type of firearms as long as they were A, registered under the District of Columbia, and B, followed certain strict storage regulations. For example, they couldn't be loaded. So essentially they were there more for as a prop and for show and less to be used in a moment of self-defense. However, there was one extenuating circumstance which people were allowed to have handguns, and that is if the chief of police gave them a 1-year tenure to have this handgun, and it would just have to be renewed on an annual basis. So Dick Heller, who's a plaintiff in this case, he worked for the Federal Judiciary Center as a security guard, and he was given this 1-year allowance to have a handgun while he was on duty. However, off duty, he tried to apply to have a license to have a handgun, and that ended up being denied by the District of Columbia under the Firearms Control Regulation Act. And then following this, Heller believed, this violates my Second Amendment right for individual freedom to keep and bear arms. So he ended up suing the District of Columbia. And then in defense, DC essentially said that the Second Amendment doesn't protect individuals' right to keep and bear arms outside of a collective sense, so outside of a state militia or any sort of army. So basically the way that this case made it to the Supreme Court was that first it started at the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia, and they ended up just dismissing the case. They didn't want to hear it. And then it went to the Court of Appeals for the DC Circuit, where they actually reversed this decision. So they wanted to hear the case for Heller, and they ended up ruling in favor for him. And then following this, DC appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which is when the Supreme Court ended up hearing this case. So the overall issue is, does the District of Columbia's Firearms Control Regulations Act of 1975, which prohibits the possession of handguns and puts this strict regulation on the storage of other type of guns, does this violate an individual freedom protected under the Second Amendment to keep and bear arms? And they ended up ruling that yes, it does, and that it clearly states that people have an individual freedom protected by the Second Amendment of the Constitution to keep and bear arms, and that this law from DC strictly was unconstitutional. So the overall analysis of this case is that there are two different parts of the Second Amendment. So there is the prefatory clause and then the operative clause. So the first clause essentially takes a lot more of a collective approach. So it's more of the argument that DC was trying to make in this sense, where it basically says that the right to keep and bear arms, yes, it is a given right, but it's only in a collective sense. So it's only in a state militia or in the army, and it's not an individual person's right. However, the operative clause takes the opposite stance, which in this stance is what Heller is trying to fight for. And it essentially says that the right to keep and bear arms is individual, and each individual person has the right to have it, as opposed to self-defense in order to use it in cases of self-defense. So obviously there is this very stark divide between two different parts of the exact same amendment, and it kind of seemed like they were going back and forth. So the overall goal of this case was to come up with a collective conclusion in order to make it a better interpretation of the Second Amendment. So basically the majority opinion in this case, they kind of talked about the historics and how historically the nation has ruled in regards to Second Amendment. And they clearly outline in this case, the majority opinion was written by Justice Scalia. He clearly outlines that historically, a lot of times the nation has preferred to follow the stance of the operative clause. So they tend to rule in favor of the individual right to keep and bear arms. And the U.S. has overall avoided to have any sort of strict regulations on firearms up until this point, which is why this law that was passed by D.C. was seen as such highly contested, because it was the most restrictive in U.S. history up until this point. And the majority opinion argues that this was mainly just because at the founding of the U.S., they were under a very oppressive and restrictive English government, and you couldn't really guarantee a lot of individual freedoms, and at that time they didn't have many. So it was really important for the founders to guarantee this individual right to self-defense, because they didn't have that under English rule. And furthermore, Justice Scalia goes on to assert that this favoring towards the operative clause doesn't necessarily make the prefatory clause like, it doesn't make it unviable, but it basically says that, like, that first clause never distinguishes that you can't use firearms in like an individual sense, and you can only use it in a collective sense. So it basically makes this firm precedent that the prefatory clause doesn't actually say that you have to use firearms in a collective sense. And additionally, he goes on to say that yes, firearm regulations are totally allowed, but they can't overarchingly not allow firearms. For example, they can't just say nobody can have a handgun, but they can make restrictions in order to make it harder for people to possess these. So for example, Scalia writes that you can make it so it's much more, you can make it not allowed for people who have felonies or who have been to jail or like the mentally ill to own a handgun, but you can't overarchingly not allow everybody to own it, because that is infringing on the individual freedom that the Second Amendment guarantees. So overall, even though the dissenting opinion seemed very strong at the time, which was presented by Stevens and Breyer, the justices, they like clearly define that there is no place in the Constitution that says that the government can't make a full broad regulation on guns. The U.S. Supreme Court ended up ruling in a 5-4 decision that Heller like won the case, essentially stating that the district's strict ban on handguns and like the storage regulations that were necessary for other guns and their like denial of Heller owning his own private handgun was strictly unconstitutional, and it directly went against the individual freedom guarantee by the operative clause of the Second Amendment for the right to keep and bear arms. So overall, the conclusion of this case was that the Supreme Court like affirmed the decision of the Court of Appeals for the DC Circuit, stating that the district's like strict ban on handguns, so in this case it was the Firearms Control Regulation Act of 1975, was completely unconstitutional under the Second Amendment. So this kind of set a precedent at the time, because up until this point, there had never really been any strict like gun regulation laws, and then once DC put this out and somebody tried to fight against it, the federal government ended up like looking at it and be like, yeah, we do want to make sure that we're protecting the individual freedom of people to keep and like bear arms, but that doesn't overall like infringe on the Constitution. It's actually like directly in the Constitution. So that was the decision on this case, and thank you so much for listening.